Welcome to the Graduate Job Podcast, your home for weekly information and inspiration to help you get the graduate job of your dreams.
Hello and welcome to the Graduate Job Podcast with your host, James Curran. The Graduate Job Podcast is your weekly home for all things related to helping you on your journey to finding that amazing job. Each week I bring together the best minds in the industry, speaking to leading authors, entrepreneurs, coaches and bloggers who bring decades of experience into a bite-sized weekly 30-minute show. Put simply, this is a show I wish I had when I graduated. In episode 42 of the Graduate Job Podcast, I'm joined by Andras Baneth, a former EU official, founder of EUtraining.eu and the author of the Ultimate EU Test Book, as we explore how to pass the EPSO test. The European Personnel Selection Office test, to give it its full title, is what stands between you and a job in the institutions of the EU, such as the European Parliament, the European Commission and the European Council, to name but a few. We explore all aspects of the EPSO test, from how to apply to how to ensure you are fully prepared for the full rigorous application process. We take you through the psychometric testing, the EPSO Assessment Centre and what you can expect in a case study, through to the new intermediate test phase. No matter where you live in the world, this episode is for you as we explore how the EU's internship scheme is open to applicants from around the world. As always, all links to everything we discuss and a full transcript are available in the show notes at graduatejobpodcast.com/EPSO. Before we start, many thanks to those of you who've completed the survey over at graduatejobpodcast.com/survey. Your feedback helps me to create the episodes you want to hear. I've timed it and it takes less than 90 seconds to do, so please get yourself over there to graduatejobpodcast.com/survey and help me out. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Before we start though, as you'll hear in the show, passing the EPSO test requires a lot of practice and hard work. So I'm pleased to say Andras has offered you, my amazing listeners, a very special 15% discount on his excellent website at EUtraining.eu. Here you can practice super realistic EPSO style tests, track your progress and make sure you're ready for the real exams. Simply enter the code EUJOB2016, that's EUJOB2016 on the checkout page to get 15% off. See the show notes at graduatejobpodcast.com/EPSO for more information. Right, let's crack on with the show. Warm welcome to Andras Baneth, man of many talents, a former EU official himself, public affairs and strategic comms expert. He's the founder of EUtraining.eu and Speaker Hub HQ, managing director of the Public Affairs Council's European Office, and the author of the Ultimate EU Test Book, to name but a few. Andras, welcome to the Graduate Job Podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It's my honor to be here.
Excellent. And today we're going to cover getting a job in the European Union. Now, not the continent, but the institutions and agencies of the European Union, such as the European Parliament, European Council, European Commission, European Court of Justice, etc., etc. So, Andras, starting at the beginning, would you like to fill us in on the process of how you begin to apply to these institutions?
Sure. It's a fairly big topic to discuss European careers, but the way I like to approach it is essentially looking at two different ways to deal with European affairs. One is to work in the institutions, and the other one is to work with the European institutions. What I mean by the first category is exactly what you just outlined. So working inside the European Parliament, inside the European Commission, inside one of the European agencies. So be a direct employee, or as they would be called, civil servant in these institutions. Whereas working with the institutions means that you deal with European affairs, but you're not directly employed by these. So for instance, if you are interested in public affairs, also known as advocacy, also known as lobbying, also known as government affairs, also known as activism, all of these areas and organizations, whether it's a civil society, an NGO, or a corporate perspective, or a think tank, they work on European issues, energy policy, foreign policy, environmental issues, and whatever else it may be, but they are not directly inside the institutions. But what we're going to discuss today is the jobs inside those institutions. Now, talking about the in part, it's basically we can look at three main types of contracts. One is to be a trainee or intern, or as they very often refer, even in English, though it's not an English word, stagiaire, coming from French, meaning, as you can guess, trainee. So getting a traineeship is usually the entry point of any European career because traineeships are fairly open and they are fairly easy to get. That means that each of the European institutions, all of the European institutions have a very structured and organized traineeship program. These are available online, so you can apply and find out more. Usually they last 5 months and they run twice a year, especially for the European Commission, which takes in about 1,200 trainees per year. The number two would be temporary agent or contract agent, but pretty much like a fixed term contract jobs, which again are fairly large in number. It runs in the thousands, but as the name suggests, they end at one point. Usually they last anything between 2 to 5 years. And then there's a number three, which is being a permanent civil servant in the European institutions, which requires the candidates to undergo the selection process administered by the European Personnel Selection Office, or as it's often referred to by its abbreviation, EPSO. So these are the three types of contracts that we can talk about while working in the European institutions. And the way to get these obviously requires very different techniques and very different approaches, but that's the formal part. What the actual job entails, so what the content, the substance of the job is, can be vastly different because someone who is formally an intern can still do extremely interesting and high responsibility jobs, whereas somebody who's a permanent official may have lower levels of responsibility, but there come other benefits or other things that go with it.
Brilliant. So starting maybe with the traineeship, the intern, so to speak, you mentioned that there were 5 months in length and there was two intakes a year. What age range do they focus on? Is it people still at university or post-university or even before university?
I don't recall the exact criterion, but as far as I remember, they would require maybe 2 or 3, I think probably 2 years of studies at the minimum, usually at university level. So 4 semesters behind you, and then you can apply. So they don't require any candidate to have a fully fledged BA, bachelor degree or master's degree, but certain minimum level of education is required. And on top of that, linguistic knowledge plays an important role. So usually English plus at least another language. And sometimes they look for, how should I put that? Something more than the average candidate, given the vast amount of candidates who would like to get an internship. They look for some extracurricular achievements, activities, whether that's a scientific achievement, whether that's any sort of publication or academic awards, whatever it may be that distinguishes a candidate from others would be certainly a big asset in the evaluation of their application.
And for the applications, do you apply to the specific institutions themselves, or is it more of a general pool and then they place you?
Interestingly, for the traineeship, it usually goes by institutions. So there's no central traineeship office. The European Commission is the largest. I don't know if the word employer is appropriate when it comes to traineeships, but it's the largest institution, or the institution that takes the largest number of interns or trainees. So the Commission has its traineeship office, but they only deal with European Commission trainees. Whereas the European Parliament, for the European Parliament, it's slightly different. Being a political institution, someone might be a trainee at the European Parliament as an administrative organization, but you can also be a trainee at individual members of the European Parliament or even at the different political groups. So for the Parliament, it's a little more fragmented. And then also the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Auditors in Luxembourg, they have interns just like the European Investment Bank. So there's no central management of the trainees.
I know from other graduate employees I've spoken to, the people who undertake traineeships and internships, they stand in really good stead for getting the actual job itself. If you complete a traineeship, is there a fast-track way for you to then go on to get a permanent job when you've finished your university course, or do you have to just apply for the same process as everybody else later on?
Unfortunately, it's the latter. So there's no fast track and there's no direct way into the institutions as a temporary or permanent official once you have completed a traineeship. So the rule is that traineeship is strictly for the fixed number of months for which you were granted that given traineeship, and there is no formal or informal way to become a temporary or a permanent official. But having said that, at the same time, you can definitely apply for the competitions, for the open competitions to become a permanent official. And I do know a few cases when an intern was actually offered a temporary job, but that was mostly due to a lot of things happening at the same time. For instance, the trainee obviously had a lot of talent, but apart from that, there was a vacancy because of a maternity leave, or there was some sort of opportunity opening up at the right time in the right place. But normally, there is no direct way. On the other side, or on the other hand, when it comes to the working with the institutions, so the private sector, or in diplomatic areas, or in advocacy organizations or similar, the opportunity of following a traineeship and getting actually a longer-term job or a longer-term opportunity afterwards is possible. So there it's a very common career path that somebody would go in as an intern, and I even know someone who's now a senior partner at a consultancy.
I mean, I imagine the experience from the traineeship will stand you instead for whichever career you want to go down. The opportunities you'll get and the work you'll be doing will be great to talk about at interviews, and the contacts you make will stand you as you go forward.
Yeah, that's correct.
And of the applications that would be received for the traineeship, do they have quotas per country, or is it entirely open? It's a strange system, let me put it that way, because the EU tries to be as democratic as possible. At the same time, it's trying to be merit-based, and it's also trying to make sure that there is no extreme disproportionality between the 28 member countries. So that's a very tall order, because you need to reconcile conflicting priorities. Because of that, what happens is when trainees apply, what they say is they are trying to establish a broad geographic balance between the applicants. So you would certainly have more German trainees than Maltese, given the sheer size of these member states. But there's no specific quotas which are prescribed. Another interesting thing is for European traineeships, it's not just EU citizens who can apply. So when it comes to these positions, anyone from a so-called third country, meaning a non-EU country, can apply. So I have personally met trainees who were coming from Costa Rica, from Israel, from the Middle East, or some Asian countries. Quite a few, but still it's important to know that there is such opportunity. So maybe some of your listeners who have an interest in European affairs would like to apply and give it a shot. Brilliant. And where can people find out more information about the traineeships that are on offer?
The traineeship itself is very easy to find out. You just Google European Commission traineeship or European institutions and traineeship, and then you can find all the relevant links online. The trickier part is, so to say, optimizing your application. And I think many of the podcasts that you have run in the past few months would come in very handy of optimizing your CV, trying to position yourself, and trying to brand yourself as a very positive candidate in the selection process.
That's a nice plug. I like that. It's definitely worth checking out the previous episodes. So moving on to the permanent official position and the EPSO application. How many people a year would be applying through the EPSO application?
A lot. That's the short answer, and the more specific and more detailed answer is that usually what happens is you'd have about 200 applicants for one post, and wow. That's quite a staggering proportion, because you might argue there are too many candidates or too few posts, depends on your perspective. But in any case, it's a very, very fierce competition, though there are some caveats. And one of the caveats is that it depends on which competition we're talking about. Now, let me give you a little bit of a background. When someone applies for a permanent EU job or a permanent EU position, they don't actually apply for a specific vacancy. They don't apply for a specific job. What they apply for is a competition. And the goal of a competition is not to fill in a very concrete vacancy, but to establish a so-called reserve list. So what you do in a competition is that you prove your abilities, that you're suitable to be chosen for a specific vacancy afterwards. But that's why EPSO is called this way, because they are the personal selection office. They are not the recruiting arm. They are the selection arm of all European institutions. So once you go through the whole process, you're placed on the reserve list, and then when an institution has a very specific vacancy, that's when they can pick from this list a relevant candidate. Now, there's quite a variation of these lists, because some lists are meant for generalists, and by generalist we mean anyone with any kind of degree can apply, and it's usually a bachelor's degree that's required. And if they pass all the tests, then they can be placed on that list. On the other hand, there are so-called specialist lists, for instance, macroeconomists, or there might be a list for nuclear scientists, or there might be yet another one for competition lawyers. So for these specialist competitions, the process is pretty much the same as for the generalists, but the chances are far higher. Because as you can imagine, if the EU is looking for competition lawyers, obviously they need someone with a relevant qualification. So the number of such candidates would be far, far smaller than for the generalists. So the ratio of 1 to 200 applies for the generalist competitions, but the more specialized a competition is, the lower the competition for those posts.
That makes sense. And how long might you be waiting on a reserve list for?
A reserve list is, let's say, probably the most sensitive part of the entire process, though to their credit, EPSO has made a lot of improvements in the past years to decrease the frustration of candidates who went through the entire process, were placed on the reserve list, and may not have managed to secure a job afterwards. So sort of say the success rate, or in marketing terms, the conversion rate of those on the reserve list actually ending up with a job is fairly high. So roughly 3/4 of them would get a job, and the remaining 1/4 very often would not get a job, not because that they would not be called for a specific position, but out of their own decision, their own will, they just change their mind, or their life circumstances have changed, or they moved to South America and they no longer want to pursue a European career. So there are so many factors there that usually it's the candidates themselves who may not be actually available anymore.
Okay, so digging into the specifics then of the EPSO application, you mentioned earlier about languages and the importance of languages. I know English and French and German are the 3 key languages in European institutions. Are they all weighted equally, or could you have French and German, or do you need English in there?
In practical sense, all 3 are weighted equally. So when it comes to the competition, someone with French and German language combination can easily pass and end up on the reserve list. It might be a little more difficult in the very end to actually get a specific job if they don't speak English. But considering the nature of this podcast, I don't think not speaking English would be an issue here. It's very often, and especially for British candidates, they're struggling, and the British government is struggling to convince enough British students to actually apply for these jobs. And they have even put in place help through the embassy or through the so-called EU mission, so the British representation towards the EU, to help such candidates and increase their chances of passing the competitions. So very often, apart from the big politics and how the EU is perceived, the practical challenge is that not enough candidates speak French or German at sufficient level as to be able to apply for these competitions. Now, there's a little loophole in the system, and that is, and we'll get to discussing what the process is for the competitions. But to anticipate that, to already highlight, there are two core parts of the competition. There's a pre-selection test followed by an assessment center. And in the pre-selection tests, which are psychometric tests, the language can be any of the EU's 24 official languages. Whereas for the assessment center, it must be English, French, or German, as long as it's different from the first language. So if somebody sits the pre-selection tests in any of those 24 languages, so let's say some of your listeners might speak Spanish, or might speak Italian, or might speak for some of the so to say odd languages, and I can say that because I'm Hungarian. So let's say somebody happened to speak Hungarian good enough, or at least learn to write, and the reading comprehension is at a sufficient level in Hungarian to take those pre-selection tests in Hungarian, then they can choose English for the assessment center. So you can play around with the languages, but the German and English and French native speakers, in some sense, are a little bit at a disadvantage if you take that, because their language choice might be a little more limited than those who speak smaller languages.
Thinking of eligibility criteria then, apart from being a member of having an EU, is it EU residency you need to apply?
It's EU citizenship.
Right. Are there any other eligibility criteria?
Other than that, there are some core eligibility criteria, fairly formal, fairly basic. So you need to be. I'm trying to recall the exact wording, but something about good moral standing. For instance, you've not been convicted. You're not under some sort of legal limitation or restriction of your rights as a citizen. You need to have completed your military service if you happen to be coming from a member state where it's compulsory. I don't know if that's the case anymore in any of the EU member states, but these are fairly basic formal criteria. The most important being is that you need to be an EU citizen. That's the formal part. When it comes to the the variable parts of the selection criteria, it usually depends on the competition we're talking about. As I said before, when it comes to generalist competitions, very often the basic criterion is that you need to have at least a bachelor's degree, but they don't require any work experience. When it comes to more specialized or specialist competitions, there the criterion tends to be a degree in that specific field and maybe 1 year or 3 years of work experience. So these are the variable parts, and it depends from one competition to the next. But one important thing, and this very podcast is called graduate jobs. So those who have just graduated or are about to graduate, they can apply for the generalist competitions, which are announced always in March. So this year's round is coming out in a few weeks, even if they actually get their degree in the summer. So you don't need to have your diploma in your hand to apply, and they don't require any work experience for the entry-level jobs or entry-level competitions to be eligible.
So if you're graduating in September, you can still dust down your application and get started in March? That's
correct.
So you mentioned the pre-selection tests. Can you take us through what makes up the different aspects of the testing?
Sure. So the core idea in all the competitions, whether we talk about specialists or generalists, or whether we talk about the two main categories, which are administrator competitions, these are the AD level, administrator, or assistant level, that's the AST level. And now there's actually a third category, kind of like a subcategory of the assistants, which is secretaries. So secretaries are not to be confused with the assistants, assistants can still do a lot of substantive policy jobs, even though the name might suggest more of a clerical function, but that's not the case. Clerical jobs are on the secretary level. So the main categories are administrator, assistant, and in some sense, the secretary competitions. The way the competitions are organized is that you always have a pre-selection test and you have an assessment center. The pre-selection tests are essentially psychometric tests. What you have there is verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, abstract reasoning, and situational judgment tests. So these are fairly classic psychometric tests. And the way EPSO approaches these is pretty much industry best practices. So you would have a very limited amount of time and quite a lot of questions for each of these exercises with a pass mark. That's usually 50%, so at least half of the answers have to be correct. And then that's where the actual competition comes in, because you not only need to pass these tests with a decent score, but you need to be among the top-ranking candidates in order to qualify for the next round.
And of that, the top ranking, will that be done across all of the different languages and people who are sitting it, or are you just competing against the people who will be sitting it at the same time as yourself?
It's anyone and everyone who's sitting in that given competition, because if you think about it logistically, it's a huge exercise, because the EU having the 28 member states, but obviously European citizens who are eligible for these competitions may be anywhere around the world. So EPSO has a contract with, I believe it's Prometric, so one of the providers who run various test centers around the world. So if you happen to find yourself in China or in Venezuela or in the United States, you can still sit these competitions and compete with everyone else in that given competition. So logistically, it's a major exercise, and the tests usually run over 2 or 3 weeks. And then the results are aggregated and the ranking is established.
So the test is done into a specific location, so there's not as much scope for people getting their mates to do the maths test for them?
No, probably no. That wouldn't be advisable.
No, definitely. And what advice would you give people on the day then to make sure that they're performing well, and or even before the test? How can people practice properly?
I don't think I'm revealing any big secret here, because a lot of people ask me for the magic method, what's the secret, and the best analogy I can find is comparing it to a sports event or preparation and training for a sports event. For instance, everybody who's in good physical health can run 100 meters, but not everybody can beat the Olympic champions and run that distance under 10 seconds. So what you really need to do is focus on the preparation, and as the same way as with every sport, you can look into the methodology, because all these tests have a very specific methodology, and I believe Ben Williams, our psychometric expert, has spoken at your podcast. So he talks about the design of psychometric tests, and understanding a bit the design, you might hack and use that understanding for your benefit to improve your performance. So there's a methodology. There is persistence and perseverance, where regular practice definitely improves the performance. So we have spoken to hundreds and hundreds of candidates, and those who use our website for the preparation services, they provide information to us, and we also see our statistics, how somebody's performance under time pressure actually improves over the weeks when they practice. So it might sound a little generic pieces of advice, but knowing that there is a method to it, and there's a system to it, and there is a certain best practice to it, can definitely improve performance. And
you put it well. The more you practice, the better you get. It's the same in golf or whatever sport you're playing. If you put the practice in, then you'll pay the benefits. And for listeners who haven't already listened, episode 35, How to Pass Psychometric Tests with Ben Williams, is well worth a listen. And Andras, say if you take the test, it doesn't go as well as you hope, is there an option to retake it, or is that it for the year?
Well, there's no option to retake that specific test. So when you're sitting one competition, then that's your chance. Those 45 minutes are your chance to actually shine. If your performance is not as good as you'd wish it to be, what you can do is sit another competition, because in any given year you have dozens of competitions that are open. You may not qualify for everything, because if they require 3 years of job experience and you don't have that, then you cannot apply based on formal grounds. But there might be several others where you do qualify, so you might try any number of these competitions. And I know people who are subscribed to 3, 4, 5 different competitions, hoping that one of them is going to work out. Usually one type of competition is being run once a year. So for instance, the generalist competition that I mentioned for administrators tends to be the most popular, because it's a generalist one, and administrator is a better paid, higher profile, with more responsibility kind of job. So that's opens mid-March. But regardless, there are many others for translators, for interpreters, for lawyers, for specialists as well. So there are other opportunities. The good thing is that there's no, I'm trying to find a good word, there's no blacklist, or there's no negative history of the tests you have taken. So you always start with a clean slate, and no one looks at how many competitions you've taken before, whether you passed or you failed.
Oh, that's good to know. And say if it doesn't go well, are you able to get any feedback on what your score was, or the areas where you might not have done well, or is it, I guess if they just get too many applications, it's difficult to do?
Indeed, you get feedback because you get your score, but unfortunately it's not the full picture, because you don't actually see the questions, the test questions that you had answered. You could only see that in the test center while you were taking it, but for the sake of confidentiality and for the integrity of their question pool, they wouldn't reveal the actual question. So all you see is that for question 23, you answered B. Whether that was correct or incorrect, that's indicated. But you wouldn't actually see what the question was unless you have fantastic memory and you recall that.
And if you do have fantastic memory, you probably wouldn't have got it wrong in the first place.
You may have. But that probably takes us to the second part of the competition, which is the assessment center. And if you happen to fail the assessment center, you do get a very detailed feedback. So whether you pass or you fail, you get a so-called competency passport. And that's a very valuable document or piece of information, because it provides a very detailed feedback about your performance, measured on the basis of the various competencies that the EPSO looks at.
Do you know the percentage of people that make it from the pre-test through to the assessment center?
Well, let me give you an example, but approach that from the other way around. So the competition always starts with a notice of competition, which mentions the number of places that are available, or the number of places that EPSO seeks to fill on the reserve list. So let's assume that there are 300 places on the reserve list. So the way they would look at it is they establish this number based on the needs of the European institutions, who said, well, we're going to need that many people. So 300 people publicly announced. The number of candidates who are invited to the assessment center in the very end is usually 2.5 times that number. So anything between, say, 700 and 900 candidates will go to the assessment center in that case. So then you take a step back and you say, okay, how many people applied? 30,000. So out of 30,000, you have 900 who actually go to the assessment center. So that's a pretty fierce competition. One thing I haven't mentioned yet, because I'm trying not to overload anyone with technical details and confuse anyone with the process. But since last year, EPSO introduced a so-called intermediate test. And that sits between the pre-selection and the assessment center. So what they do is they actually have more people pass the pre-selection, and they get them to sit a so-called E-tray exercise. So it's yet another layer of sifting and a certain number of those who pass the E-Tray exercise can actually go to the assessment center. And the reason why they introduced this is because they didn't want to fail so many people in the pre-selection test who would then go to the assessment center, because the pool of the candidates was not large enough. So they tried to include this intermediate step to, well, increase the quality of the candidates, and also to give maybe a little more chance to the initial applications.
It shows the importance of making sure that you're top of your game for the psychometric testing. If they're whittling down that many people and only 900 people, for example, are getting through to or 700 people are getting through to the assessment centre, you really need to be in that top percentage quartile of people.
Yeah, that's correct. I know a lot of people who passed but didn't pass. So they did, in formal terms, they got points or scores high enough to pass all of these tests, but they weren't in the top cut, the top percentage or percentile of the successful candidates.
So in the assessment centre, what would that be made up of?
The assessment centre has a bit of variation from one competition to the next, but by and large, what you have in the assessment centre is 3 or 4 core exercises. And there's a case study. In technical terms, it usually takes place a few weeks before the actual assessment center, but in procedural terms, it's part of the assessment center because the case study evaluates competencies. So it doesn't look at knowledge, it looks at competencies. And then a part of the assessment center is a structured interview or competency-based interview. There is also a group exercise, and often, not for all competitions, but most, there is an oral presentation. And then if we're talking about specialist exams, say the ones I mentioned, like nuclear inspector or competition lawyer or development cooperation advisor, for these, there would be a second interview which tests a person's technical knowledge or technical background. Or for interpreters, translators, there would be an actual translation exam where they need to use a source language and translate that into their main language.
And you mentioned the case study then a couple of weeks before. What would that be? They'd send you it a couple of weeks before and you've got a couple of weeks to work on it, or you have to submit it a couple of weeks before and then you talk about it when you get there?
No, actually it's a standalone, exercise or exam which takes place in an exam center. So it's not that they would send you any document that you work on on your own, but what happens is you go to the test center again, and it's a computer-based case study which features a lot of background materials, all sorts, very diverse type and range of documents, emails, newsletters, European regulations, whatnot, and you need to process that information and answer 2 or 3 fairly broad questions. But the point there is they don't test your knowledge, so you don't need to go there with any pre-existing knowledge about the EU or any other field, but you need to demonstrate your writing skills, you need to demonstrate your communication skills, you need to demonstrate your analytical skills, your so-called delivering quality and results, that you're able to come up with sensible solutions and answers to the questions raised. So it tests a lot of things, but not your knowledge. Hence the importance of those background documents that you need to read during the exam.
So I'm just conscious of the time. I want to be respectful of your time, Andras. So maybe one final question just on the assessment centre process. What advice would you give candidates to ensure that they stand out and perform at their best at the assessment centre?
The assessment centre is the most fun part of the exam or of the competition, because the concept of the pre-selection test is to select out, meaning that there are so many candidates that they had to find a scientifically valid way which is gender neutral or sort of say education neutral and test people, but it's not related to the actual job. On the other hand, the assessment center is about selecting in. So there they are looking for qualities and competencies and skills that someone needs to have in order to work for the European institutions. So preparing for the assessment center is essentially improving your presentation skills. It's essentially about using your writing skills. It's using your interpersonal skills in the group exercise. So there are a lot of good things that you can, as a part of your self-development, that you can invest in, and that's going to pay off. Whether or not you pass the assessment center, hopefully you do, but even if you don't, it's still a valuable investment in your own personal development.
I love that. That's a really nice way of putting it, that the assessment center is your chance to select yourself in as opposed to get yourself selected out.
Yeah.
That's I like that. So, Andras, time is running away with us. So, a couple of final questions before we finish. Our weekly staples of questions. What one book would you recommend that our listeners read?
There's one book which I particularly like. It's probably more than like. I love that book, and I do a lot of trainings on the basis of that book. It's called Made to Stick. It's about effective communication. It's about making memorable messages that sticks, that the audience will remember. And it's given me so much in terms of how I speak, how I write, how I communicate in general. So I very much recommend it. It's written by two American brothers, Chip and Dan Heath, and it's available on all online platforms.
Excellent. That's a new one on me, but just like the book and everything that we've discussed today will be available in the show notes at graduatejobpodcast.com/EPSO, and you'll be able to find out all links to everything we've discussed. Excellent. And Andras, what one website would you recommend that our listeners visit?
This one I haven't given much thought to because I myself follow so many news sources and other sites. For job seekers or for those who are interested in the EPSO jobs, it might sound too selfish, but our site on EUtraining.eu, we have so much free information, ebooks, tips and tricks, and tons of free webcasts that I hope will provide a lot of value and further information to anyone who's interested in that. So maybe that's not the broad generic website you might expect from me, but off the top of my head, this is something I would surely recommend.
We don't mind a little bit of nepotism.
Or actually, may I add to this? There's a new website which I just launched, and some of your extrovert readers and listeners might be interested. It's called speakerhub.com, which is a platform and completely free platform for anyone who's into public speaking or is a trainer or a moderator can sign up and then be found by conference organizers. And that's a brand new project that I've launched, so I'm really recommending anyone to join and be more visible when it comes to their most interesting topics.
Oh, brilliant. And as I said, I'll link to that in the show notes, listeners, to be able to find out more about it in the show notes.
Great.
And Andras has been very generous, and we have a special discount code for listeners, which I will be revealing shortly for EUtraining.eu. So if you've got an EPSO test coming up, you know where to go to get all of your hints, tips, and practice tests. So keep listening, and I'll reveal all of what you need to do. And finally, Andras, what one tip would you give listeners that they can implement today on their job hunt?
I think one tip, and now I talk more generally about job hunts, so not EU jobs or specifically European affairs jobs. But I think leveraging the internet is what they need to do more. When I speak to graduates, when I speak to those who are at the very beginning of their professional career, it's amazing that everybody's on Facebook, everybody's using social media, but very few people actually understand the deeper layers of the internet's capabilities to brand themselves and to showcase themselves. A very, very, very basic, simple example is that if they've written a thesis, why not put it on various websites, SlideShare, Script.com, whichever it may be, and link to it from their professional resumes or CVs. So especially if you're not a native speaker and you'd like to showcase your English writing skills, what better way than actually demonstrating it through your thesis or any writing piece, or starting a blog and try to dig deeper in the topics where you'd like to have an employment in. So using the internet, it's probably there are tons of books written on that, but very few people, at least among those that I speak to, actually understand how they can use it and leverage it for their professional advancement.
I think that's brilliant advice, and definitely one that listeners should look towards. I mean, starting a blog is such a great idea, and it's one that we've touched upon in recent episodes. Just a good way to get your brand out there and get your presence out there, and start to build a presence that people can find. Andras, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the Graduate Job Podcast. What is the best way for listeners to stay in touch with you and to find out more about the things that you're working on?
Very simple. They are very welcome to have a look at my personal site, which is my surname, so Baneth, BANETH.eu. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm more than happy to help anyone with advice, with ideas, or just pointing them to a relevant link that gives an answer to whatever question they may have.
Andras, many thanks for appearing on the Graduate Job Podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Many thanks to Andras for his time today and for being an all-round great guest. I hope you found it useful and it's inspired you to apply. One key takeaway for me to leave you with is practice makes perfect. As Andras said, the EPSO process is very competitive. Yes, lots of people apply, but you have to be in it to win it. That said, if you do apply, make sure you put the hard work in. Practice, 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 and practice some more. As the saying goes, there is no glory in practice, but without practice, there is no glory. Make sure you know your verbal and numerical test inside out, and that your language skills are up to scratch. To that end, take advantage of the 15% off all of the practice tests over at EUtraining.eu. Use code EUJOB2016 for 15% off. Let me know how you get on. It's always lovely to hear your success stories. For more information about everything we've discussed today and a full transcript, go to the show notes at graduatejobpodcast.com/EPSO. That's EPSO. So there you go. Thanks for listening. Please leave me a review on iTunes if you've enjoyed the show. If you want to get in touch, you can hit me up on Twitter at gradjobpodcast or hello@graduatejobpodcast.com if you want to drop me a mail. It's always great to hear your thoughts and what you think and how you're getting on with your job applications. Please do also check out a short couple of questions at graduatejobpodcast.com/survey. It will be a big help, and it only takes you about a minute to do. I hope you enjoyed the show today, but more importantly, I hope you use it and apply it. See you next week.